Welcome to the Texans.
And again, Watson escapes. Over the middle, it's caught. Akins, and the tight end rumbles in for the touchdown.
Here's Watson now. Blockers in front. Lowers the shoulder and in.
He throws on the run. Touchdown. Unbelievable.
And welcome to another episode of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles after a visit to a blustery Cleveland, where a game was delayed 37 minutes due to weather. The Texans return home 2-7 when it felt like a running game absent on both sides of the ball. There was a sense of doom right from the start, but try and work this one through again this week. We'll do our best. Making his first appearance on the Turn Up For What podcast is Radio 610 and Radio.com, and the host of the B Block podcast, Brandon Scott. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, man. It's been a rough season for the Texans and to follow the Texans, but glad to do what I do and, finding ways each and every week to make some fun out of it. And so I'm doing pretty good, man. I appreciate you for having me.
No, thanks for the time. I think it's an odd one, I think, and it makes doing things like this, and I'm sure being in the media and press conferences with the coaches and the players kind of difficult, because it feels like it's the same theme pretty much every week.
Yeah, it's funny that you even mentioned that because, just the day before we're recording this, we had Romeo Crennel on, and even post-game on Sunday after the Browns game, I'm in the post-game Zoom and I'm regularly asking questions to the players and the coaches, and, it's not a odd thing for me to do, but I found myself, honestly, after the game on Sunday and even Monday, after having some time to sleep on it and let it marinate, I didn't really have much to say, or as far as asking questions, because it was a lot of the same old issues that we've already addressed and already talked about. And I got this thing about not asking questions just for the sake of asking questions, unless for some reason you find out you're the only person in the press conference and you have to ask the questions. But, I found myself in kind of that headspace where it's like, well, I don't even really know what else to say, because we've talked about gap discipline. We've talked about, the issues along the offensive line and the inability to run the ball. There were some interesting things about the game that we could have touched on and that, other media members have touched on, but it just felt like the same old, where I didn't feel like asking the same old questions again. So.
Yeah, and I remember you asking in a press conference, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I remember you asked O'Brien a question about, did you feel like you addressed all the needs you needed to in the off season on defense?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember that, but
I
it stuck out. It's one of the most, partly because I think when somebody asks a question that you're thinking yourself, it kind of sticks with you. And I was thinking that, and it seemed blatantly obvious all off season that we just didn't address needs and actually got worse, and actually paid some players to get worse.
Yeah.
But I remember when he answered that question to you, I don't even think he convinced himself of the answer. And one of his answers was, we've got a bit of versatility at linebacker, which is, with secondary, is probably our weakest spot on this depth chart at the minute. And it just feels every week, like you're saying, it was all coming crashing down. People maybe just didn't want to see it in some instances, and in other instances that it was coming, there's just nothing you could do about it. And it feels like it's all kind of, showing its head in different guises, but predominantly around the run game and the defense every week.
Yeah, and just thinking back, I do remember that. And just thinking back to it, man, Bill O'Brien's got to be the first coach to make me loathe the term versatility. Normally when you hear someone talk about guys being versatile or wanting to have versatile players on their team, whatever sport it is, you're like, oh yeah, versatility. You like, or almost in anything, period, that you can think of, versatility is great. But the issue here was, they've got guys that they think are versatile, but and can do a number of things, but don't do any of those things necessarily at a high level. They're just almost versatile for the sake of being versatile, but they don't really add value to your football team. Eric Murray may be a versatile player. He may be a guy that you can put at safety and maybe I guess, put him at corner and do all these different things with him, but he's not that good at any of it. Lonnie Johnson Jr. is a guy now who and I imagine we might get into some of this at some point, but he's a guy now who's played cornerback, who was drafted as a cornerback, now plays safety, presumably in a pinch can play either now in the framework in which they have him now, but isn't necessarily that good at either, And so, you think about the versatile guys on the team, and you're just like, I mean, if you got to give me a guy that does one thing, but he does it really, really well, give me that. I do remember thinking that in the moment when he answered that question, and as far as the defense goes, I mean, I asked that question for a clear reason, right? Like you don't. It's almost like in a lawyer in court, you don't necessarily ask a question that you either don't know the answer to or have an idea, at least in this context. And I knew the answer to that question. I just needed him to answer for it in the moment. And what could he say? What could he say? I mean, it was kind of obvious, and it's all sort of proving itself out on the field halfway into the season, over halfway into
Yeah,
the season now.
yeah, and it's an odd take on versatility, and I think you just bring up such a great point there. That's it's layered in so many ways. It's layered. That was the other BS that we got fed, wasn't it? Layers of
Yeah, yeah. There's a
productive
buzzword you
players.
in there, man. Buzzwords.
And and you know where those come from. We'll come on to that guy as well soon. Um, but the versatility aspect of it, you've got players who both in two of our most troubled spots, one offensive line, who are guys are just not playing up to their draft slate or their compensation or just the ability that we all know they have and they've put out on film. They've just not done that this season, or if they've just not done it on a regular basis. And that's on the offensive line. And that's been somewhere we've talked about versatility. And like you said, in the secondary, another spot which is a disaster for this team this year, again, around versatility. And you get to the situation where we've got guys who, are the masters of none, but a jack of all trades, and
Yeah.
it's, we just want fundamental football players. And that's what every team wants. Okay. And I don't think, they've ever tried to not do that. But then what really bugs me about that at the same time, when you flip it on its head to the special teams aspect of this roster, there is guys who are not versatile. Buddy Howell has been on this team for 3 years and apparently can't carry the football for 5 runs in a game just to mix it up. Some of your tendencies. You've got a guy like Michael Thomas, who's a special teams player, shouldn't be on the field in defense, but is. When you think, of guys that we've paid in the past and bigger contracts where actually you could just get some of that level of talent or that level of contribution as a late round draft pick. You might hold them for 2 to 3 years and you find another one. But yet we've got these guys in and we've paid them good money. And that's right across special teams, whether that be kicker, punter, gunner, all these we've brought in guys and give them sort of $2 million a year, and they're not really worth it when you could get somebody on, the rookie minimum of a 6 round pick. And it's if and look, it's obvious, right? There was never a great plan at foot, and we're now seeing the end of that as we go 2-7 rather. I wish it was 7-2.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned special teams with, you know, DeAndre Carter reportedly has been released. And I think about, you know, special teams and and some of the guys that you mentioned, like Michael Thomas playing and all of that you mentioned. All of that is just so curious. Buddy Howe, you mentioned, can't carry the football. They got Duke Johnson out there against the Browns on Sunday. And, obviously we know the circumstances there, why he's the starting back. For a lot of people, and myself included, should have been the starting back a while ago. That, once David Johnson, after a few weeks, showed you that there wasn't a lot of pop there, I think they should have at least experimented with that and done more with that. But we knew he was going to take the bulk of the carries. How it is that you can bring up CJ Prosize from the practice squad and, already have Buddy Howe on the roster, on the active roster, and neither of these guys can get carries. I'm not necessarily clamoring for them to get carries per se. I'm just saying the fact that you don't have the confidence in these guys when you're giving the bulk of the carries to someone who does not carry. He's not a bell cow, has not been, at least in his career, in his NFL career. And you can't get carries for either one of these two guys. To me, it says a lot either about those players, about your player evaluation, your coaching. It says nothing good about anything, to not be able to rely on those guys, and or to feel like you can at least. And so I know that's got to be frustrating for fans to think, man, this is what the running game is. They can't block, nor do they have more than one guy outside of a guy who's been a career backup that they feel confident handing the ball off to. Even their starter who went out, you know. So it is difficult to wrap your head around the DeAndre Carter thing. I don't know if you remember a couple of weeks ago during the bye week, we had, so during the bye week they bring in the position coaches, and
Yeah.
we get to talk to them for a little while, a little short, rapid fire deal with the position coaches. And I asked Smith, um, Carl Smith's son, Tracy. I was blanking on his first name. Tracy Smith, the new special teams coordinator. Uh, what? Why can't you get Kiki QT out there? Without saying as much, because you don't want to be disrespectful, and they let
Yeah.
you in the press conference. But without saying as much, I'm like, DeAndre Carter's not a playmaker. With respect to the guy, I love his story. You know, from all accounts, hell of a guy, but not a playmaker. This is football, not a playmaker. Why not get Kiki QT out there? And he gave me the spiel about how he drops the ball and doesn't have a lot of experience of fielding it. But it's like, hey man, what do you guys do at practice? This is a professional football player, and to be clear, I've watched him field punts and kicks, albeit in practice. I saw it with my own two eyes in training camp. It's not like it's impossible. And Kiki QT, to be honest, and to be frank about it, is prone to some of the same mistakes that DeAndre Carter is. But I just think, man, you can't get this guy on the field on offense, and you're not really doing anything in your return game. What? Why not explore that? And so it was refreshing, at least, to see them do that against the Browns, or at least find themselves in positions where they could utilize Will Fuller and CJ Procise in some capacity, since they signed him, from the practice squad and brought him up, at least not for nothing. And
Yeah. Yeah.
with the release of DeAndre Carter, I think that kind of just hammers home the point that I was making of, hey, you needed to mix it up there, and that what you were doing was just not going to get it done.
And you hope that sends a message of accountability to the players, first and foremost, of, this guy wasn't getting it done. He's no longer here. And
Sure.
sometimes, in the O'Brien era, that was done rashly at times.
Yeah.
Deontay Foreman was probably a good example of that. Could have used them right about now. But I think, we will be ever tainted with the Bill O'Brien legacy for the next 18 months to 2 years, maybe even three, depending on how, astute the next front office is. But I think if you look back on that as well, that the inability of the previous regime to understand the requisite skill set that their scheme needed to be successful. And that goes for wide receiver, and it goes for no more than running back. You think we're paying those two contracts to Duke and David. Okay, David gets knocked out last week, takes a concussion, puts him on IR. So he's out for 3 weeks. So it must have been, and you think, was it really that bad a concussion? I've seen worse, and guys, pre all the protocols, play, in the following weeks. So, how much of that is, we'll use it as an excuse to take him out the firing line, and we'll try something else. But I think when you look at the running back position, you think Procise was on the roster when Duke had the ankle injury after week one when he hobbled off against Kansas City. Procise didn't get any carries then. So what was different now? And the answer was nothing. We were just going to run it all with one back in a game which the conditions dictated you needed to run the ball. And we
Right.
hadn't run the ball all season. And you think if you even go back to the Blue and Miller days, of O'Brien, and, Alfred Blue completely misused. And then you think of Duke and David on this roster as well, expensively acquired talent that you can't simply run the ball. You think of the third round pick for a guy who was third on the depth chart, another guy who was ironically third on the depth chart in Arizona ends up coming over, and you give a gross over evaluation as respect to how, with respect to how running backs are valued around the league. And you think, if there's anybody that comes in at running back for this team, it's got to be a rookie. We can't, with the salary cap dropping, we can't, you know, I mean, I don't think any competent front office would, but we can't overvalue that position anymore, particularly, and how bad we are at that position. And it's bad. But I think the talent's one thing with this, Brandon. But I wrote an article last week on the website podcast Texans.com just about the coaching as well. And the secondary overlay from the O'Brien era is the coaching. And and I think as you said, it was quite telling, some of the interviews in the bye week. But I think the biggest issue with this coaching staff is, well, I just don't think it's very good. But then also, if you think about the guys who have been in the building, or how many lasted through the 7 years of O'Brien's era, how many guys like Anthony Midget went to Tennessee, Wes Welker left, talking about Kiki there, was a big part of his, selection and his development in year one.
Yeah.
How many of these guys walked out to take the same job somewhere else? It wasn't career advancement. So I think when you take all those factors of bad valuation and then just not great coaching and good coaches leaving to take the same position elsewhere, I think that those are two of the biggest contributing factors of why we just look hapless at times on the field. And Sunday was another example of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, man. The stain and the stench of Bill O'Brien, I think, firing him energized for a moment. There was some optimism about what the future might hold now that you've done the thing that a lot of your fans have been clamoring for, and what I would say objective anonymous observers even would say, this is probably what you need to do. You probably need to move on from this guy. That they did it resonated for a moment, and I think it took a while, and especially after, winning a game, and, Romeo Crennel's dancing in the locker room, and everyone, doing the Macarena in the locker room, and everyone's having fun for a week or two. And then you have this sobering moment and understanding and realization of what's happened to the franchise. And that, the point that you make about the coaches that have gotten out of here to take the same job or even be promoted in some cases, it's telling. And the ones that have stayed, the ones that are still left over, and the ones that have been brought in, and you just think, yeah, this isn't good enough. It didn't look good enough on paper, when you think about it. And then the play on the field has shown that, So I think this is just kind of where the franchise is, having to, you know, right some wrongs, maybe undo some things, unlearn some things. I really worry about, as far as the direction of the franchise, who Cal McNair necessarily listens to. I don't know where he gets his advice. I don't have a good beat on that, and it concerns me for the franchise and for the future of it, especially given what you have with Deshaun Watson. He's only 24, 25 years old for so long, and this is for all of this is fragile, and it doesn't seem like they treated it that way. It was a lot of recklessness and just simply poor coaching as well, like you mentioned. Talked about the offensive line earlier, and yeah, man, I just, it is hard to watch, because you look at the roster and you think, man, this isn't, especially on defense, right? This is not a talented defense by any stretch. But you still think, man, could they be better than that? They could be better than this, though. This cannot be what it is, even with the lack of talent.
I don't think you can at any point underestimate. Even there will be some guys leave just because the salary cap's going to drop, and there will be business decisions to be made. Hopefully, better business decisions that were made in the last 18 months. But regardless of, if you were to lose just if talent was a value, you were able to evaluate talent just by a number. Say we're playing Madden for a second or whatever, and every player's got a rating. You always kind of see consternation of that every year, right? And it always makes me think, well, what's the point of even talking about it? Because it's just subjective, right? And that's why people get paid, because they've got to have an opinion in the league to acquire the talent. But even if this talent of this roster went down, even a mildly better coaching staff could get a better result out of this team. And look, I mean, there have been games that have been close. Minnesota, the Pittsburgh one sticks out the worst. Actually, when you think you've just had a piece one drive together in the second half, you got a chance. And you're right, when it comes back to one man and one man only. And I've last couple of sort of articles that I've written on podcasttexans.com, I've basically directly addressed them to Cal in a sense that where is this team going? And you've got a short window, or even shorter window than you would have otherwise if you'd acted earlier, to address this, I think. And I think and before we get onto some of the game, Brandon, there's two examples that I picked up this week. And I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but of any of them, so don't worry about commenting on all of them if you don't want to. But so there was an off-field move where an executive, somebody who's a VP of this team, leaves unannounced midweek prior to lead up to a game mid-season. And then when you've also got another executive on this team talking about a publication that they've launched, and they use the quote, and I'm paraphrasing here to a degree, but win or lose, we still hit the metrics. The title of it is winning, and by my count, this team hasn't won anything worth a damn in its 18-year history.
You're correct.
But when you've got those two moves, one shows problems behind the scenes, and the second one of those shows a complete disregard for its fan base. I thought the book publication, and I got an email this morning, to invite me to the webinar if I wanted to join and listen about this book. But I just felt, in the current climate of how bad this team is, to release that book either was just it struck me as two things. Is that somebody who's teamed themselves up for a move out of this and wants out, and it's a publicity stunt to get their name out there? Somebody who's probably not been necessarily in the limelight, and who I've had personal dealings with, and I couldn't say nicer things about on an individual level. But to release that, I just thought, for guys like me, for the guys I travel to the games every year or have done up to this year, I just felt like a slap in the face in terms of that, because this team just hasn't won anything. I just thought it showed out of touch. And the point I make is Cal out of touch just because some of his staff are equally out of touch with what the city and what people, like myself, and there's people in all sorts of countries download this podcast and listen to this. People I would never have thought you could, even be a remote chance to be a Texans fan. And it just felt like completely out of touch with what's going on and actually how bad this mess could well be, could become, as we head into next year.
Yeah, I think that you're speaking to something that is pretty consistent, at least over the last few years with the organization, you could say, and that's this level of tone deafness, like to not have an understanding for the weight of your decisions or how your fan base might feel about a certain thing, or just public perception in general. Like, forget even just the fans, just like I mentioned, anonymous observers, objective observers. There are people who have no axe to grind, they have no dog in the fight, whatever cliche, and they're looking at this like, what in the hell are you guys doing? You're gonna trade DeAndre Hopkins? Like, who advised that? Who authorized that? Where were the checks and balances? Who was the rational person to talk down whoever it was that wanted to do that? Like, you figure that should exist somewhere in the infrastructure. And to the examples that you bring up here with the, one executive being dismissed and another executive who was in charge of that the person who essentially dismissed this one, has a book coming out in the same days, rolling out the book in the same days in which they've let go a well-respected, whatever. There are people who have different stories and personal experiences on this matter, but overall, a well-respected official across the league. Like, this wasn't some small move, and the timing of it. I mentioned this last week, either on the B Block podcast or I'm sure on my own podcast or another. But the idea that you need a culture change at the VP of communications or whatever the exact title is, the idea that you need a culture change at that spot in the midst of a losing season is asinine to me. It makes no sense. It does not compute. What is the culture change? What is the thing that does? What does that do that changes your losing culture? And when I talk about tone deafness, it's like you realize that you've won 2 games, right? Like you have not done anything. Like it right now it's a bad culture, and it starts on the field right now, but from a 30-foot view, you're looking at it like, hey, it starts up top. We see the players, we see the coaches failing, but then when you get headlines behind the scenes, oh, we're gonna fire the VP of communications. We're gonna bring back, the interim head coach who was never ever considered to be a head coaching candidate in any conversation anywhere in the last however many years. Like these curious moves, like it really makes you wonder about, just like I mentioned earlier, who's advising the decision makers and what does that look like? Because
And
from the results that we get, it just cannot be good. And those the timing of the examples that you mentioned with the book and the dismissal of the PR exec, it, only the Texans, right? This was a joke made on Twitter, right? Only the Texans could create a PR firestorm by firing or dismissing the head of their PR staff. And the poetry there is fitting for what the Texans have been over the last couple of years.
yeah, I mean, and I'll give a small example. I mean, I remember when 2019, when it all still felt, that the good days were just around the corner. I messaged, Amy to say we're going to the draft. Can you help? Can you help us out with tickets? And she did it. And I was
Yeah.
just a random guy, you know, wasn't doing the podcast at that point. No kind of affiliation bar being a fan. Just, told her, the reasons where we're going. Some guys flying over from the UK to go and experience it. Always wanted to go to Nashville. And she did it. And it
Yeah.
happened. And that was just one tiny example, right? Um, and look, I know there was some issues about, if you put the wrong stuff up online at training camp or whatever, you were quickly messaged to bring it back down and all those kind of stuff. But that's just part of the job that, whoever that person is next on will need to, deal with as well. But I just when a team consistently makes decisions which is just met with complete, universal negativity across the media spectrum, right across America, everybody can't be wrong all the time, and
Yeah.
you saw players come out and you saw, a variance uh, of different kind of different people come and, you know, make clear that they just didn't agree with a decision that seemed odd. And the fact that it's around culture fit, I don't know. And did that move link into the story that we saw break out on Sunday morning about, potentially punting on the 2021 season? Because when I saw that, Brandon, I was apoplectic. I couldn't believe that you were seeing that. And when you reflect on it now, you think that surely isn't possible for so many reasons. That, Cornell, and if anybody's wondered what that is, it's Cornell was going to be the coach and Easterby would continue to oversee off-field matters. I could not believe that when I saw that come out, and I just, I've never
Yeah.
kind of, been worked up before a game starts in that way. But I was, and I think that probably just shows you the lack of trust that anybody could feasibly have in this organization at this point when that story's coming like that now. Do you think they were linked, and that's just Ian Rappaport trying to basically stir up a new connection, and all the stories, that got to him, was that the link, and that's why that link's been removed? I don't know. You never know. These guys. I mean, I always think that the whole concept, you don't have it in other sports. Certainly
Mm.
not in sports that I've grown up watching in terms of insiders, which are basically both, or almost, rubber stamped leaks. So yeah, I just thought it just seemed like another slap in the face, which has been a long season.
Yeah, so my thought on that, I don't see a link, but I could be wrong. I'm not ruling that out, but I don't see a link there. I think what you saw with Amy, the PR exec, was something that actually happened in the building, and something actually happened there. I think that there's some smoke and mirrors going on with that Rappaport deal. Like he's of the most credible NFL reporters that's out there, so he didn't make that up. He didn't pull that out of thin air. That came from somewhere. I am not convinced, 100% convinced that that came out of the building from someone who is actually making the decisions. I don't think that that came from any of the actual decision makers. My guess is that could have even come from someone outside the building who was there, or someone who's still there and has ties to someone who was let go. In which case, that could be the link. So I'm not. That's why I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah.
There could be someone with an axe to grind based off of what's happened over the course of the season, whether it be what happened after week 4 or what just happened after last week that we're talking about. But so this could be the ramifications of that. Someone feeding Rappaport something that would be a little spicy, and who knows, there could be something to it, some legs to it, of at least being thrown out there. Maybe Romeo wants to do it. Who knows? We have not asked him that directly, and we should.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody asked him on Monday, did they? Because I watched it, and I think that, I mean, yeah, I mean, when it stacks up, when you think of why would you pay a search firm, and they've basically paid the search firm for exclusivity, so you can imagine that's a 6 7 figure sum that Cal's
Mm.
written to Corn Ferry already, okay, and then you think, why would somebody at 74, who's not really a good NFL coach anyway, he's been a great defensive coordinator, 5 Super Bowl rings,
Right.
but he's surely not got, within a COVID climate. I mean, it's been admirable how a guy of that age has come in, and he was a calming influence in the furore that was the O'Brien whirlwind of emotion and bad moves, and he was probably what was needed at the time. Now, I don't think we can forget, it's pretty much well documented that it was going to be offered to Anthony Weaver,
Right.
and it was suggested that Cronell takes it. So,
Right.
with him in the wings, so that story, when you reflect upon it, the days later you think, well, it's maybe just been put out there for a reason. But then I start to think, is that part of the wider narrative now, that this team just can't get out its own way, just like O'Brien was a nutcase? This is the
Mm.
next narrative about the team. Like, we're not even talked about the Browns game yet in any depth, but for a year the Browns were a mess, and there's always a team that's a punching bag. Are we just that until we prove people wrong now?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we this is the laughing stock of the NFL right now. I think partly because of the failure of this year. I think if you couple that with what's happening with DeAndre Hopkins, and obviously the Hail Mary catch from Sunday that's going to go down as an all timer. With the trade as the backdrop, and the failures of the Texans subsequent the trade, after the trade being the backdrop of it all, it's a laughing stock. I mean, the Texans were the laughing stock on social media on Sunday night, right? Like after that play happened, they've lost, the Texans have, to the Browns, in a game that no one probably would have found interesting outside of Texans and Browns fans, unless you had a vested interest in the game. And then this magical thing happens with DeAndre Hopkins. Absolutely, it is the laughing stock of the NFL right now. But I wanted to make a point about Romeo Crennel, since we were on it, and why it would not make sense, just from a logical standpoint and from an optic standpoint, why it would look so bad. Like, aside from the good point that you make, that he's just has not proven himself to be a good NFL head coach over time. Romeo Crennel, already a proven and established guy. Well, as we mentioned, he's 73 years. He's in his 70s. He's coached in the NFL since the 80s. So, at least for a long time. This is not a new guy. He's been on the staff the entire time. He's been there the entire time. And so it's not an issue of, hey, this guy was being developed. Hey, we just brought this guy in. None of that. Cornell is a finished product. So if you make him the head coach, you are conceding that the person that should have been your head coach has been on your staff the entire time. It would not be the same as if you elevated Anthony Weaver or even Tim Kelly, just to throw in the discussion of a younger coach that you're developing, training, and perhaps wasn't ready before but is ready now. That's not what this is. That would make more sense if the interim was someone that you were going to promote to be the permanent guy. But in this case, you made him the interim because he was already established, because he's a finished product, because you needed a steady hand, not because you thought that perhaps this is the up and coming blossoming head coach that you've been waiting for. That's not what this is. And so just the notion is flawed to begin with, because like I said, to me, you're conceding that if you somehow think that Romeo Cornell is your next head coach, you're conceding that this guy who has been on your staff the entire time, and you somehow neglected to put him in the position that he was supposed to be in. Which again, I'm rejecting the idea to begin with, but just to follow the logic there does not pan out. It does not play out for me.
Yeah, and it feeds into that again. And it because like the future of this team and Deshaun's career right now depends upon Cal McNair's ability to pull his head out his ass and understand what a mess we're in, and how this whole thing needs. You need to drain the swamp from top to bottom. And that
Yes.
includes every single one of this coaching staff,
Yeah.
scouts, debatable. Personnel exec. James Litford, Matt Bazergin, all these guys. I think if I'm Cal, I think that we just need to restart the whole thing, the whole damn thing, right from the top to bottom, because it feeds into the narrative that Cal thinks that this team's actually good,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it just needed a tweak, like you're saying about the coach. And you think that we just people just want to win, and he wants to win in his heart of hearts, but I just don't think he knows how to go about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I accept and appreciate that thought process from the players. Like when we talk to Deshaun, Deshaun Watson or JJ Watt about rebuilding and how they don't want to rebuild, just I think it was JJ Watt who brought that up. I don't want to be in a rebuild. And then I asked Deshaun later about that. What do you think about it? Do you think this is a rebuild? Of course, they don't view it that way, nor should they. And I can appreciate that from them as a competitor. But as the person in charge of the future of the franchise, whether that be Cal, whether that be hell, even Jack Easterby, or whoever it is that becomes in charge of the future of the franchise, of building the roster or reconstructing the roster, that can't be your mentality. You have to have a drain the swamp mentality when it comes to this team, because it is all bad. It is just not there are just not a couple of things that you need to change. There are just a couple of things that you need to keep. It's the
Yeah,
opposite. You've got a couple of pieces, and they're obvious, right? Deshaun Watson, an obvious one, and maybe the most and only obvious one outside of Deshaun Watson and Laramie Tunsil, the left tackle that you've paid a great deal to protect him. And then outside of that, everything needs to be open to evaluation at the very least, and at least from the coaching standpoint, drain the swamp. 100% with you.
yeah, and I think Cal has sat back and watched this team buy high and sell low on so many facets, whether that being cap dollars, his cap dollars, by the way,
Yeah.
or and it's admirable in a sense that you know if the team needs investment, we'll invest. And there was a big article. I think there was one in the Albert Breer Sports Illustrated. There was one in Peter King's preseason. They were trying to drum up some positive PR for the team. And then you could maybe think that the head of PR was doing a good job at that point, but there was a concerted effort to do that. But yeah, it all just seems so naive when actually you can win the lottery, but you can spend it like an idiot and be broke pretty quickly, and that's kind of basically the sort of sorry cycle that Cal's let his inherited franchise get into. And I think the issue is, I think talking just before we wrap up on the coaching staff, I think to me the clearest point I think was Brandon Cooks and Cobb have both come into this team, been in the league a long time, and they've both made, not direct comments, but pretty clear as day that they've said that they're not happy with the level of coaching that this team's got or the quality of practice. And I think that was just a testament to how bad it's got of the yes men or whatever you want to call them that O'Brien kept around. That it's not good enough to get results out or get talent out of a lesser roster. We've probably had a talented roster, which is, beat the teams we should have, not won the big games. Last season looked to be a bit of a turning point, but we blew it in the most spectacular way possible. You think there would be never any comeback for a coach to blow a 26-point lead in the playoffs. But he was given it, again, naively from, ownership. What finds us in, and we end up playing a Cleveland Browns team who have been the butt of the jokes, and it feels like we've definitely replaced them, I think. And I think the coaching point, Brandon, I think is the coaching has hemmed this offense in because we could not have spent more money on time and investment and cap dollars and draft picks into this offense. Like we did that grossly negligently against the defense. So we've let the defense completely erode, and it was always going to be this season. Could the offense shine the light and lead the way? But then when it gets, a blustery day in Cleveland, they can only muster 7 points.
Yeah, it's and we talked about this, or you mentioned it earlier. It was a game where running the ball was going to be vital for either team, for both teams. I watched the tape from the previous game with the Browns and the Raiders, I believe it was, and that was, you know, that was a really really tough one. And I thought, man, this is not going to be, this is not going to be fun, for a team that likes to, flashy is the right word, but has invested in speed and wants to, drive the ball downfield. And, their only redeeming quality seems to be Deshaun Watson, and whenever he's brilliant, And so I thought, hey, they're going to have to play a game that they're not good at playing. That's going to have to be what this is. And at times they did it. I don't think you can watch that game and for a second think that the Browns didn't outplay the Texans. I think they outplayed them thoroughly, but the Texans hung in there at times, and it was a winnable game. I think that's the part about it too that is probably the most frustrating is that they played a game that they were set up to lose in, built to fail because they don't do the things well that you need to do to win that game. And there they were still in it with an opportunity to do it, and they just couldn't do it. And the ways in which they couldn't do it were so glaring. They highlighted where the team is weak, right? With the tackling and you know, disciplining your gap. That, gap discipline. Imagine that. And not just that, but the lack of like if you're not disciplining your gap, that has to mean what? That you're good, that you must be good at making plays, right? Like you have to be but so talented to not be gap disciplined. So it's like one or the other. They're either not disciplined or not talented or both. And that's highlighted in this game. And so it was a game in which I did not like. I think I picked on my podcast last week that the score would be 19-13 Browns. I thought that there would at least be some scoring. I was not expecting a 3-0 halftime, and to have taken very little notes by the time by the time halftime had arrived. Like it was just it was just really really rough to watch. The Texans get beat up in the places where that they're weak, and that's on the inside, that's on the interior. And they just didn't have it. They didn't have it, and it was a winnable game. They've got the opportunity there at the end, and they and they come up short the way that they have all season. So it wasn't surprising, but all the same disappointing when you think of, hey, somehow they had a chance to sort of steal this game and just couldn't do it.
Yeah, and I think that I think that at any point, if you said to me, any game, you have to take it or leave it now. Your defense will hold a team to 10 points. You'd take it every single week.
Yep.
And and it wasn't without the chances, but I think just before we move on to some of the key decisions, gap discipline. You talked about that, and I was trying on the All 22 comes out on a Tuesday. I put clips and some of my observations, and I'm not going to say I'm the most classically trained in pro football, but sometimes I think a lot of it is it's just in the tape, and I saw Brett Veach talk about that before, and he said it's not about what you just have to watch it enough times and see it, and everyone can see it. You
Yep.
just got to put in the effort, and I think that's true.
It is. It's
Because
very
it's a
true.
game that's probably clouded with a lot of terminology. But actually, the basics of what those terminology mean is just to hide that from your opponent. So, but I put out, and I've often been critical of this guy. And look, when I first started watching this team, he was everything about this team. He was Mr. Houston. He'll probably go into the Hall of Fame as Mr. Houston for the efforts, Hurricane, Harvey, and so forth. But at this stage of his career, when you'd want to talk about gap discipline, when the guy who you've basically built the entire defense around continues to not set the edge, he did it for the touchdown, he did it twice on the opening drive, he
Yep.
did it a number of times now. Somebody messaged back and said, "Well, do you want to show us the TFLs as well?" And it's fine, but I think exactly the point what you've just made there, Brenda, was JJ used to do that. If you take him as an example, he used to do that, but it didn't matter because he made so many great plays, sacks, TFLs, forced fumbles. That actually said, well, we can live with that because for every run that they break to the outside, you may be giving us three or four plays that have put the opposing offense behind the chains. But at this stage of his career, with all the injuries and it's not for the lack of trying, is the juice isn't there anymore. Just like the juice isn't there with Whitney Merciless, and that's been harrowing in terms of the contract that he's been given.
Yeah.
So I think it's an issue that this defense is a lack of talent. There's older players that are getting overpaid, and they just didn't replace the talent when and how they needed to. And that stems all the way right from 2017 off 2018 off season, right? And it's just culminated in that gradual drain. And we don't want to go over it again because everybody knows they should have kept Kareem Jackson, they should have kept AJ Boye, they should have kept DJ Reader, they should have kept Jadavian Clown. If you put all those guys on this defense right now, probably got a championship roster. And that's the difference of all these decisions make up to this point. But actually, the reality is we're 3 years away from that. And I think beating the Browns was almost getting beat by the Browns in a way like that, where they only scored one touchdown. Was it was almost poetic in the fact that how far we have fallen. I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. A point about JJ that I want to make that speaks to the desperation on defense. JJ's not nearly the player he was, right? He's an all-time
Yeah,
great. He had a stretch there where he's as dominant as anybody that's ever played up front. But he's not that guy anymore. Still, not being that guy, being maybe 60 to 7, I don't know, I don't want to put a non-scientific percentage on it, but not being the guy that he was. Let's call it 70% of what he was. He is still by far their best player up front. I mean, you could argue Zach Cunningham, and that's its own conversation and its own issue. And he's a dynamic player who does some frustrating things at times. And he probably actually is your best guy up front. But let's take him out of the equation, like the guys really up front in the trenches. JJ Watt's your best guy by a mile, and it speaks to the issues that I think this team has where JJ Watt's the best, like I just said, the best defensive player or the best defensive lineman on this team by a mile. That should not be the case. Bradley Roby is your best cornerback by a mile. No disrespect to Bradley Roby, but that should not be the case. Like they have guys in positions and playing in roles that they should not be in. and that is the story of the team, at least of the defense for sure. And you could make the same argument about how the running game is implemented and how, like we were saying earlier, their evaluation of running backs and things of that nature. But specifically with the defense, I mean, there are guys in roles that they just should not be in or should have been passed by now. Like you've seen the best of Whitney Merciless, you've seen the best of J.J. Watt. Bradley Roby should be your second best corner. And if he's your first best corner, your second best corner can't be drastically worse than he is. You know, like that, like these are the things that have to come together and have not, so that's just sort of the story of the team right now.
And if you come back to say Anthony Weaver, for example, and I think he started the year well, but it's declined. And I saw a tweet. I think it was Rivers McCowan before the game, and he said, if you just take it in isolation, take all the names out, for example, but you put a single high safety in the box, you take a big rangy corner and put him at free safety.
Yeah.
You take a safety and move him to slot corner. You take the slot corner and move him out onto the perimeter.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to work? And if you asked any coach, whether it be Pop Warner, Friday night lights, up the road, from NRG or wherever it would be, or any sport or any context, it wouldn't work, and you would get a universal, chuckle out of it. It's just so ridiculous. But yeah, that's the position that Vernon Hargreaves finds himself in, who
Yeah.
is not capable of being, in that 3rd and 18 or 3rd and 19 that they converted was a backbreaker, just as there was. And I don't know why Anthony Weaver keeps doing this. And it's been my pet hate, and I've watched it for weeks now, probably since the Minnesota game. At what point does he think that this defense is good enough to only rush 3? Because it's not. It just simply isn't. And he did it right, the second last drive before the Browns killed it, and he rushed 3. It was a 3rd and 8, a 3rd and 9, anyway, 3rd and long, and they run a draw play, and they basically killed the game at that point. So I think there's a mixture again of, just as he said, poor talent, but I just don't think Weaver is doing enough, or he's probably almost doing too much to get some of these to get the best out of the poor hand that he's dealt talent wise on his defense.
Yeah, and that's a curious thing too about, like, why is he rushing 3? I thought he did a little bit more with blitzing against the Jaguars in the game that they had, in the previous week, and I was somewhat encouraged by that. Like, you saw corner blitzes that I feel like you didn't, and safety blitzes that I don't feel like you see nearly often enough. And so, why they went away from that, I have no idea. I have no idea. But the thing that you mentioned just real quick about, moving on the Rivers McCown tweet and moving everybody out of their spots, it speaks to them really believing in that versatility line that they were feeding us this whole time. Like,
Yeah,
you know, sink or swim, for better or worse, they really actually believe in, this jack of all trades, master of none philosophy, and it's not working. It is just simply not working, and then it looks so bad when it doesn't work, because you're like, well, okay, this doesn't make sense to begin with. It seems like it was destined to fail. When you move guys around like that who are not all to begin with, not elite at what they actually do. To think that you can go, you know, that Eric Murray, who's not even an elite safety, is going to be able to play slot corner for you is
paid him like one though.
yeah, and they paid him like one. I have no words, man. I have no words for that one, because it's like, okay, no one knows who this guy is. How do how do you guys figure? How do you figure
Yeah,
that Eric Murray
yeah.
is going to be able to come in here and be and start at safety for you, and spell you at corner, and no one's ever heard of the guy?
That's the first time we've ever signed somebody. I've been watching this team for just coming on a decade, and that's the first time we've ever signed somebody that wasn't to the practice squad, that I've had to Google and just work out who the hell it was when it first came up. And I was like, oh, that guy, he was at the Chiefs and he was at the Browns. Okay, right. And I think, again, it comes back. We don't want to repeat ourselves, but it's different. I think the couple of decisions that, again, came down to the head coach, certainly in terms of the way he phrased it. Because I think if you think of the transition, right, and we thought, we get rid of O'Brien, it solves all our problems. And anybody watching this team in the first 4 weeks would probably have told you an honest assessment that that was not the case. But
Yeah.
then you have Jacksonville and a get right game, and it was actually a tight game that people choose to forget before a fourth down call, and Brandon Cooks goes and scores his first touchdown of the season at that point. You take that aggressiveness out, and then you get bad results. And actually, O'Brien was almost living through some of these coaches this week because the offense was incredibly conservative, played within itself, seemed hesitant to try and attack, which actually Cleveland played a lot of single high.
Yeah.
They expected the short passing game, and it felt like Tim Kelly had kind of set it up for kind of dink and dunk stuff. And a part of that I would agree with the conditions, but you had to drive enough wrinkles in there to break away some tendencies. But the difference was that Cornell came in, bit of life, goes for that fourth down call. Then and then he goes for the play, but on the first or the second drive, the first drive is 3 and out, as it has
Yeah.
been classically for much of the year. Second drive, Cobb drops it in the end zone, and then they go for a draw play on fourth down. And it felt like that play was just, I don't know. I mean, look, these guys are paid far more than I'll ever earn to make these decisions. But that a draw play at that point without a lead blocker seemed kind of a strange decision to make when it's an all or nothing play. There was no kind of roll out, and fair enough, there's a dump off like there was in the Cobb play. You can see, I can kind of admire that play because you think, well, it almost worked. You should have got it, but there you
Yeah.
go. But that play, I thought there, I think with hindsight, you would have been better kicking the field goal if you'd have known how tight the game was. Because the longer the clock ticks on, and you're sitting with a zero, that just adds pressure. And you saw that when they came out in the second half.
Yeah. So I like the decision and was just baffled by the play call. And honestly, if I'm not going hindsight here, if I don't play the results and just live in the moment and how I felt and what I thought, I just don't understand why the plays weren't flip flopped. Like if you were gonna do that, and obviously don't run that play at all if you don't have a lead blocker. I mean, what the hell? But if you're gonna run the play, do that one on third down. And then the pass that Cobb dropped, the pick play that they ran on third down should have been the fourth down play. And to me, and again, I'm just like you. I don't get paid to do this to call plays. Never done it outside of playing Madden, in a video game. But to me, that just seemed to be the more logical thing to do. Not for your all, like you said, not for your all or nothing play. Let it be a draw play for Deshaun Watson without a lead blocker. And then the way that I knew that that this was not going to work was, or maybe this is actually hindsight if I'm honest about it, but I can remember watching the game and Matt Millen, the color commentary on the game, called out both plays. He called out both plays and was 100% correct on them. And my thought is, man, if Matt Millen, you know, old as he is, and if Matt Millen's calling your plays out, I got a sense that the Browns defense might have a beat on it too. And it certainly felt like it and seemed like it when they ran those plays.
You know what, that would have
Yeah.
been the perfect play for that speed option. They've run it so many times. You could have run that twice, once to either side, or
Yep.
something that you've done that you. Okay, I know it didn't necessarily work with that Green Bay game. It was an emphatic fail, and maybe
Yes.
they scrubbed it out of that. But with a guy like Duke Johnson with a bit more juice in his legs, it's probably an okay play to run. Or you do it to a tight end, or you do, just do something. But I think that the overall point is the fact that you and I can sit and talk about how basically obvious it was,
Yeah.
and every week there is such a limit of creativity. You could count on one hand plays that you go, all right, quite like that. And that shouldn't be the case. At this level, defenses are too good to not have enough creativity week to week. It just bewilders me every week, Brandon, how Tim Kelly isn't able to install 5, 6 kind of got to have it, different situation plays. They're going, guys, this is a new install this week. On a 3rd and 1, we're going to do this. Because
Yeah.
that just does not seem to be happening right now.
Yeah. No, I mean they don't have it, man. I mean, the later in the game, the timeout before the field goal,
Oh, yeah.
that I mean, they admit to us, I didn't know what we wanted to do there.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like for you to, like, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't think I knew what I wanted to do there either. If I'm 100% honest with you, and it, after I thought about it, I'd like to go for it. But I need you, the coach, to know what you want to do there. I'm not being paid to do this job. So I have an excuse, but you've got to know. And to burn a timeout in that moment and not have it. I mean, it speaks. I feel like it speaks to the same point that you're making about Tim Kelly
Yeah.
not having those plays that he can rely on in those key down and distance situations.
And that was a killer losing that timeout. But I can't remember the exact personnel group about him. But it just, again, just a similar point I made a second ago. But for the life of me, I can't understand why, for a second, we haven't got a one word call in the huddle. And it might be whatever the hell you want it to be. If we're in 11 personnel, we've got one that goes left, one that goes right, and you go hurry up and you run it as quick as you can, so as everybody's set. When you've got and you see the Patriots do it all the time when there's maybe going to be a challenge or what or whatever. You want to just get up to the line and make a quick play, or it's a QB sneak or whatever it might be. But I just can't believe we've not got emergency, quick 1 or 2 yard plays in the back pocket. That every single player on that roster, 53, whether he's on special teams or whether he's on the practice squad, knows that that's what we do, for this week, and you change it every week. But it just seems so basic. And I know it's easy to sit here and criticize the Monday morning or Tuesday morning quarterback, but I think
Exactly.
it just seems like it could be better. And I think that's the biggest frustration and my biggest frustration for Watson. I hope it doesn't continue beyond this year as much as it has done, but it just feels like he's been hemmed in. And you saw that in the offense because I think they weren't aggressive enough. And then the first drive out the second half, you get the ball back, you think it's 3-0 half time. We've got a chance in this one. You come out in the second half and you actually, Titus Howard runs a sort of kind of power play across the formation, seals off the edge, and Duke gets his biggest run of the day. And you thought, okay, here we go. But then again, when it comes back to the play calling and coaching, if you go for a shot on first and second down, why call a Yankee concept again for the second time in 3 downs when you need to get a first down? And the whole point of this game is time of possession because it's a bad conditions.
Yeah, man. And I want to go back real quick to a point that you made about sort of the pace a little bit, like, and not seeing it to the untrained eye. Even it seems like an offense that's unsure. It moves
Yeah,
like an offense that is unsure of itself. One of the buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot in our press conferences and in these discussions is tempo. Why don't they play with more tempo? Why doesn't the offense play with more tempo? And I don't think that a lot of us who use the term actually really know what it means. I don't think it's necessarily tempo or no huddle, so to speak, as it is just knowing what you're doing. Like it seems like after every play, they're like, okay, now what, guys?
yeah.
Like that didn't work. Now what? Or that did work. Now what? And I'm not accusing them of not having a plan or not actually game planning for these games. I'm sure that they do, but it's just not obvious to the even to the untrained eye. And there are folks who break down this thing way better than I do who would agree with me, who would say the same thing, that they just don't really seem to have a good grip for what it is that they want to do in a certain situation. And I think you know the example that you laid out speaks to that perfectly.
And as well, do you remember Hard Knocks? It was the
Oh yeah,
preseason game against the 49ers. And
yeah,
O'Brien's coming out and he's going, speed this slow shit up. And you think
yeah,
that was then. So that was his coaching fundamentals at that point. So, and I think, again, it probably goes back to the point of, I think he just lost sight, as these coaches have, of the fundamentals or the key points that they held dear. And he got too over focused on other things. But it just, yeah, it just seems like things are stale, like you said, and it's not. And again, it just comes back to the point of, you think, if you get a short play, okay, so say one of those plays do come off, then they go for it. Fuller, and it almost like the wind catches it. He gets one hand and it just sort of drops kind of very
yep,
slowly next to his. Then he's got press coverage on the outside. Denzel Ward next down. He tries to knock it in. Fuller doesn't really get the separation from the line on his get off, and then actually there was the next play where they run another two receiver route on third down, which I just don't get.
yeah,
But actually, Brandon Cooks is away, but his actual route, instead of just being a straight go or a 9 route, it's an in cut at the top, and the safety just takes Deshaun away from it, and then he ends up trying to spill it out to Duke for a dump off, and he's hit as he throws, and you're off the field again. I thought at that point, I think this game's probably gone on too far without us scoring, and it just kind of compounded, as I said, as long as the clock ticks on, you don't score. But then what I didn't get about it is when they did go for the field goal, we'll put the fake punt aside, or the fake field goal punt, whatever the hell that was. I mean, you, you, we'll come on to that, why that was ineffective, and they showed that right at the end of the game. But why did they not go for it on 4th and 3 and try and kick a field goal at that point when you want to hold on to the ball? Anything under 4 and 5, I think you've just got to go for it. There's nothing to lose at this point in the season.
Well, and I wanted to mention too that one that Will Fuller got his hand on, that was just a bad ball by Deshaun. I think that was a ball Deshaun would
Yeah,
like
didn't
back.
lay it out. Yeah.
And perhaps I don't know, I wasn't there at the game, but the conditions did not seem friendly. Obviously, I mean, we've talked about that already. It was a game that was built for the run game, but the weather conditions. But I don't know how much Deshaun was affected by the weather, especially as a guy who doesn't play in those conditions a lot. But to the point that you made just now, yeah, no, I was somewhat uncertain in the moment. I struggled in the moment as well, if I'm honest with you. But in retrospect, man, I'm like, yeah, look, you you need to you need to score the ball. And the issue with the field goal, I would have felt better about in better conditions. But like the field goal is not the only argument for the field goal is that it's the sure thing. That is the singular argument for the field goal if you're going to do it, if you're not going to be aggressive. And in these conditions, it wasn't that. I mean, he even said, and I would agree with this, that, Kaimi kicked that ball about as good as he could, and it just didn't, you know, just I think the wind pushed it, and that was not the right decision right there. I think you need to keep it in the hands of your offense because you've got a much better chance of getting those 3 yards than you do of knocking down that field goal. So that's where I'm at on that. That given the weather and the fact that Duke had shown some pop, I think on that drive they were a little bit inconsistent running the ball. But do something, do something with your offense. Put the ball in Deshaun Watson's hand. I don't care if it's if it's got to be a read option play. I would have been much more comfortable with them being aggressive there. And again, let's go back to logic, man. What is the consistency of the logic that had you go for it way earlier in the game, but not right there in that moment? Where
Yeah,
to me
and
it's a much more desperate point of the game. So I
And
don't
I,
understand.
I think when you think about it situationally as well, right? So you think you're right in front of the post, probably the best chance you're going to get to kick it, shortest field goal possible.
Mhm.
Kick it there, tie the game up, keep it going. But I think fair enough, you don't have the benefit of how the game's played out at that point. So yeah, fair enough, you missed. But then to then not go for it on 4th and 3rd when you didn't kick a field goal before because you said you were concerned about the conditions, to
Yes.
then kick that field goal later on from a further distance just seemed inconsistent in the decision making.
Yes.
And to call the timeout, like we already talked about, at the same time, when you needed to, when you're chasing a game, you need the timeouts and you want to hold on to them as long as possible. Didn't do that. So from that point of view, disappointing. So yeah, I think in that moment to not go for it, it seemed weak. But I think that the moment that it was almost so predictable, like all this game is, and probably all this we've talked about, you get the score, and we'll put to aside that either Fuller or Farrell Brown run the wrong route because they're in the basically in the same position when Brown gets his first touchdown for the team. And I think, yeah, I mean the
What a
lack of
goofy touchdown, right? What a goofy,
yeah,
goofy touchdown.
but I just thought all game, why were the tight ends not involved in the passing game, and why has Jordan Aikens been relegated in terms of touches when it felt like short passes to the tight ends were going to rule the roost that day?
Yeah, so I wondered about that as well. At one point I thought, okay, is he fully back to himself? Is he not 100%? But whenever they do experiment with that, he looks fine to me physically. I don't know.
Yeah.
And we haven't spoken to him since he came back from the concussion, and I think it was a low. I can't remember if it was a ankle or a leg or whatever it was. And so like we haven't been able to speak with him on that matter. But when you look at him, you're like, hey, he doesn't seem limited. What's the deal here? Like, especially when you consider what he was from a production standpoint before the injury. Before Harrison Smith knocks him out of the Vikings game, he was among the favorite targets, along with Fuller, was pretty much a go-to guy for Deshaun, and now he seems to be like just a phenomenal. I don't know. It's like he's Kenny Stills in the offense now.
Yeah.
Like he's just a guy. And I thought that he had shown an ability to be a go-to. So I didn't I don't understand that at all.
With,
I Oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say what I don't get was how Kenny Stills has not become a go-to this year. When he was a go-to week one, when he only arrived, less than a week before his first game and catches what should have been a game winner against New Orleans.
Right.
And you think, so what's changed? And I
Yeah,
don't know if
yeah.
it's the calling or the just that having consistently having a Cobb in the slot. But then you think actually you take that money that you've paid Cobb, and you could argue it was a move you didn't need to make. You just could have said to Kenny, "Look, Kenny, it's 1 year. I want you and Kiki to split the snaps in the slot." And this is and these are going to be your go-to plays on third and fourth down and third and short. So it just seems odd that we've just basically taken a guy who I think still is getting 7 or 8 million this year, and
7. Yeah. 7, I believe it was. Yeah.
yeah, and he's not seeing the ball, and I just think how much that defense could use 7 or 8 million worth of talent, which could be three role players potentially, but. Yeah, we don't want to go over old ground. But the point I was going to make there, Brandon, was that they muff the kickoff and when we've just scored, so there's 3 points in it, and we pin them down in their 5 yard line. And I thought at that point, after all this I've been watching, 37-minute delay, we've finally got to this point. I think we've got a chance if we could just get a three and out here. And it couldn't have been less. They couldn't have made it more. No, I don't think it was easy, but you saw that, and you saw JJ's comments, and Justin Reed missed a tackle, and he's had a terrible year. Justin Reed, he's not. I
Terrible.
don't think he's had a good game all year by his
No.
standards, or what we know he can play by. And I don't know if all the injuries have just mounted up and he's just not the player. But again, I think it comes back to the point: he's not a box safety; he's a single high guy with a bit of mobility and agility to cover up on the back end. But at that point, I thought, we've got a chance. But then again, the common notion or the common sentiment that I have at the end of every Texans week in this year is I just felt so naive when I watched. I think it was Kareem Hunt or Chubb. I can't remember. Stepped out of bounds right at the end and just took it up to the 1 yard line.
It was Chubb.
Chubb, yeah,
Yeah, it was Chubb. And yeah, man, naivety is the sickness, I feel like, for the Texans fan,
yeah,
because they do things at times that make you think, all right, it's gonna turn here. It's not a helpless team. It's not or I should say, hopeless team. They and in that moment you think, yeah, well, no one's been able to score for the most part all game, with these small exceptions. And so, yeah, you think that in that situation you're good. And I mean, just to Justin Reed, that's literally box safety or not, man. Box safety or not, that's basically, I mean, he's dead to rights there, Chubb is. That's exactly how that play is supposed to go, for the most part.
yeah,
That is exactly where you want to be, and what was JJ's quote after the game, from my vantage, I think we ask these very generic questions sometimes of, hey, what did you see? What was your vantage point? And we all saw the same exact thing. It was
yeah,
a very clear. You do not need to be a football savant to see what happened on that play. And so, JJ says, hey, we got the guy 4 or 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage, and then he was at the 1 yard line. Because that's literally what happened, man. He gets by Justin Reed, and with not even just a slight hesitation there. That wasn't the, juke him out of his shoes, or a
yeah.
Barry Sanders jump cut,
It's a
you
bad angle.
know, yeah, just a bad angle from Justin Reed. and then of course the bigger guys are unable to even touch Kareem Hunt on the sideline as he or I should say Nick Chubb as he goes down the sideline, and and the story goes as it goes. So yeah, man, naivety, but at the same time, you know, I can blame you for being naive, maybe because the Texans have shown you over and over that they're going to break your hearts. But at the same time, you look at that play and you think, well, no way, no way. If you do the freeze frame right before you realize that Justin Reed's going to take the bad angle, you do the freeze frame there, and you're like, well, no way he's going to make it down that sideline with this crowded group here. There's too many bodies here for him to make it through. And just lo and behold, sure enough, he did. So it's I mean, it was just deflating,
Yeah,
deflating to watch it end that way when, this is not a good defense, not a good run defense, but at times they, with the exception of, and we talked about JJ earlier, they not filling his gaps and things of that nature, not being the player that he used to be to be able to do those sort of things. But at times, this defense was adequate, not good or great, but
yeah.
adequate. It was at times. And then you get that realization right there in that play. Oh yeah, that's right. This is the defense that's not good at all. This is who we thought they were.
And it feels like, again, just repetition, but it feels like, if you thought about the Baltimore game, it happened in Pittsburgh and it happened again on Sunday, and it's happened a number of other times as well, that the dam just breaks in the run defense and they just give up a hell of a lot of yards in the fourth quarter. And it works both ways, because you could argue, as you said, they just need to do enough to keep them in the game. But the offense then doesn't do enough, and then they just can't, they can't stop the bleeding, and it just spirals and gives a sense or a lack of positives that you can take out the game when a game ends like that. I think if you have the ball and you're driving and you try and score and you don't, you think, or they score last second if you leave too much time on the clock. Those, like Tennessee, you can kind of take those defeats, but defeats where it just the other team's nailing it out, gives you very little positivity for the next week. And the next week is, our old foes from New England, who I don't really know what to make of them, but they could be sitting at 500 after they play after they come to Houston on Sunday.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. As far as what the Patriots are, they look nothing to me, nothing like the Patriots that I've come to know and understand. So I have to totally, recalculate on, what it means for the Patriots to be coming here. It felt totally different last year. And I thought that was, maybe one of the Texans' better wins last year. Maybe for some fool's gold, maybe made you think that they were better than they were. But one of their better wins last year, and now, I'm interested to see what they do now after going against one of the better rushing attacks in the league, and now they have to deal with Cam Newton, who looks a lot better than he did when he first came back from COVID, from the COVID list, and this sort of seems to be looking more like he did at the very beginning of the season. They've always struggled with mobile quarterbacks, but Cam is of a different variety because he's mobile and he's a bruiser and he's a big guy. He's the size of your linebackers, maybe bigger, right? So in some cases, so I do not feel good about, like, how do you feel about the Texans in short yardage situations with Cam Newton uh, running the show for the Patriots? I'm terrified of it, if I'm honest with you. You know,
Yeah, and
I think and he's not the guy that he used to be. He used to be an automatic, in those scenarios. But when I look at this defense and what they've shown so far, you know, I see them having a really tough time in this game.
I can't, I think people talked about there was a 4 game stretch here where we could maybe breathe some life into the season, but when you looked at the Browns and then you looked at New England and you watch how they ran the ball on a defense or on a defensive Baltimore. Okay, it was the conditions were again the conditions dictated. I'm not seeing rain like that at a game for a while, but it was it was a game where they've coached their way back into it. And if you think when I know Seattle were flying high at the time and have kind of dipped off and lost the last two, but they played well against Seattle and should have won. And I don't think Houston have ever beaten Cam, have they?
Cam, yeah, you know what? I don't.
Because
I'd have to look that up.
2015 was week one or week two, I think, in Carolina. That was the
Yeah, I
year
don't
they
think
went
so.
to the Super Bowl, and then he was in the league the 4 years prior, which would have been 2011, and I don't think they won that one either.
Yeah,
Memory serves me
2011
correct.
that was his rookie year. 2011.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and you just think the way this defense is set up. Now, I think the difference between I mean, I suppose because it was Jarvis Landry and Rashad Higgins, right? That was who was out there, and we struggled to cope with them. And you think just sell out and stop the run, short and intermediate stuff. There's no Edelman, there's no Gronk anymore, obviously in Tampa. This should be a simpler format to stop them on offense, but I just don't think we can stop the run, even if we put eight, 9-man boxes and stack it up. I just still think they'll find ways for us to miss tackles or misdirect, and it kind of feels walking into it's going to be the same as this Sunday. Is can they stop the dam for long enough breaking in terms of the run defense? And does Deshaun, because he's from that he's from going to Clemson and Carolina, and he's talked about a link with Cam. Does that bring out an otherworldly performance that we've probably not seen? Where you've thought Deshaun just took a grip of this game from the first second and didn't let go every time he got on the field. Do you think that's going to be enough to inspire him against what was effectively a mentor for him when he's coming through the ranks of high school and college?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not really sure how much. Yeah, I think that Deshaun, at least the way I'd like to see it, that he'd just be inspired by all the losing. I can tell you for a fact that last year when they played the Patriots, he was inspired by playing against Tom Brady, and that he wanted a win against the GOAT
Yeah,
before the GOAT. And at that time, we didn't know if Brady was going to retire or what the future was going to look like. So in Deshaun's mind at the time, he wants to get a win over this guy before he goes out to pasture. So I know that motivated him. It could be something similar here, just from a different angle, like what you mentioned of him, looking up to Cam coming up. They're both actually kind of Georgia guys. They're both from the Atlanta area, so um I know for a fact that that's a guy that if you're Deshaun's age, you looked up to somebody like Cam, so I mean that could be something there. But what you mentioned about simple things, and this being a game where it's a sort of a simple formula to beat them. You would feel good about that as a Texans fan if you felt like the Texans did the simple things well. And it actually seems to be the simple things that they struggle with,
yeah. And
most. So,
I remember watching in the year that New England won it. They beat the Rams in a sort of defensive masterclass. They If you remember the game against San Francisco, so not San Francisco, sorry, San Diego at the time, but now LA, they came in there and they probably weren't the better team, but they found a way just to run the ball and they just ran a lot of I formation. And not to go back earlier, but why the hell a team that can't run the ball have they not just put a fullback in there and see what happens? And I think that's it speaks again to the lack of willingness to try new things. When you need to run the ball, Gillespie is sitting there, plays his special teams. Don't think he's shown anything other than some signs of positivity, but he doesn't get any snaps, so it's hard for
right.
him to be tuned in totally. But if you can't run the ball, and we've not got and we're probably going to be focused on giving Duke enough carries, but or we didn't give him enough carries. But why didn't you just simple thing like that? Just put Cullen Gillespie in there, let him be the lead blocker. Might only do it for 3 series out of the 8 or 9 that you have the ball, but just see if it works and if it helps you run the ball on the ground, because we're going to need to balance this attack out against a Belichick's sort of led defense, because you can't be too predictable or it'll just be it won't be it'll be another defeat. I think it's just simple as that.
Yeah, I'm with you on the lead blocker with Gillespie and the I formation, but I think where I'd push back is that, I mean, you still have to get push from your guards.
Yeah.
Like you can't that doesn't work with the offensive line play that you're getting on either side. And for all of the I know that the talk is often focused on the right side about, because Laramie Tunsil is so good. And so people look at Titus Howard whenever there's a shortcoming, and then Zach Fulton hasn't been good at all. But I mean, I feel like that's the side they run to more often. And then with at left guard, quiet is kept, that's been a disaster, and so I, I'm not really sure, man. I'm be honest with you. Like I love I'm open to anything, like at this point. So I'm not shutting it down or saying, hey, don't do that. But as far as hope or naivety, as we talked about earlier, man, I ain't got it. I'm not there. I'm not convinced that, just simply making Gillespie the lead backer is gonna be the solution to a run, a rushing attack that can't push. I mean, you've got to go. And what I don't understand for the life of me, I can never understand struggling in run blocking, because I was always told, at least, that offensive linemen like to go forward. That's what they want to do. That they get amped to run the ball. So, you know, to me, it seemed like what you described should fit to their sensibilities and what they should want to do, sort of at the core of them as offensive linemen, and obviously with Cullen Gillespie at fullback. Why they don't do any of that more, I think it speaks to the production that they've had, and maybe the sobering realization that they don't have the personnel to do those things well.
Yeah, and I think it's yeah. I mean, I don't expect them in any way to do that. I really don't. Just something as simple, or
Yeah,
iterative to the offense as that.
and also with Deshaun, I know I've gotten a lot better with this, but there was a point. I can't remember where I stopped being this way, but there was a point where every time Deshaun got under center and wasn't in shotgun, I thought, what the hell are they doing? Deshaun doesn't know what he's doing under center. But obviously, you have to coach him up and help him figure that out. But there would have been a time when I would have rejected that entirely, because I just didn't feel like that was the best way to use Deshaun Watson. And so, I mean, it's nice to see that he's better under center, and I would love for them to be able to line up in the I formation and go. And so, honestly, I'm just waiting to see at what point do they address the personnel issues along the offensive line that we thought was going to be fantastic. And maybe it's not a personnel issue, maybe it's coaching. Maybe that's what the answer is there. But yeah, I'm open to all the solutions, but don't necessarily believe in any of them until we get some wholesale changes.
And I think a wholesale change that I don't think there'll be many. You'll be hard pressed not to find somebody who's of a Texans concern would want this change, and you think it'd be the first general manager move to do. But in terms of Jack Easterby, did Bill Belichick's comment of he's not a personnel guy? Do you think that low key comment, and I'm sure Cal will see it? Do you think that saved us in some ways?
I know that there's a belief that it did. Maybe I'm too optimistic on this part, but I don't think that anyone necessarily thought that he was. I think the misstep here is maybe the thought that he doesn't have to be to do the job that they've set him up to do. That maybe he can build this roster without being a personnel guy. Because I mean, no one who knows him would tell you that. I think it was shock. It was somewhat shocking, and I'm sitting right in the same spot that I was when I was on that call with Bill Belichick, and he said that, and there was a moment of silence, a pause, because there was just the shock that he would just say it out loud, or that someone with Bill Belichick's credibility would say this out loud and articulate this thing that we all already knew. This is already understood, but that he would say it. But I don't know if Cal McNair actually believes that he is, but that he is drawn to the things that he does do well, the things that by all accounts Jack Easterby is good at. And that's being a people person, I don't know if he's a consensus builder. I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for to use a political term, but he's a guy that people like want to be around, it seems like. And I don't know what that does for building a football roster. Like I don't see how that translates. And again, it's part of what bothers me and concerns me about who Kyle McNair gets his advice from, and what is he prone to listen to? What does he believe in? What does he think success looks like, or how you build success, the formula to it. So I mean, I don't know because I'm not sure if it was a revelation. It was damning, and I do know just based off of my own Twitter account that they've gotten a lot of attention for it. That there's been a lot of focus on it. There's been a lot of talk about what Bill Belichick said about the person who has been tasked with overseeing the football operation side of this team. For him to just say point blank that he's not a personnel person, but I don't know. I don't know how that resonates with Cal, and if that was what he viewed him as to begin with, or if he views this character coaching aspect of Jack Easterby, this thing that he does do well apparently, as like something that's important to the overall, ethos and construction of the team. It's an odd element because we're dealing with a couple of things here that I think are delicate. There's like religion going on,
Yeah.
and it is an awkward place because like I'm not here to crap on anybody's religion or anything
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah,
but I'm just kind of like, hey man, this doesn't really like you guys can pray and believe and do all of these things. I'm far be it from me, but none of these things compute or relate to where we are, the state of affairs. I even think about like with DeAndre Hopkins and the baby mamas thing that came up that we never got any clarity on, but was
yeah.
odd and awkward of a story. And then you uh, think about what's the culture that seems to be trying to be laid out for the team. And it's just an odd thing. It's like, man, I don't really care if DeAndre Hopkins has 20 baby mamas because
Yeah, if you can catch touchdowns on a Sunday, we can let it slide,
right.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah, because it concerns me none, and if it hasn't taken him out of the game, like if the drama is not taking him away from the field, or I don't even want to call it drama, I don't even want to characterize it as that because I have no idea what his life's like. But man, the guy performs. He shows up. He can't practice 3 or 4 days out of the week, but he shows up on Sunday. I've never heard of hey, he doesn't practice, but he does perform on Sunday, and that being a problem. Like I thought in
Yeah.
the NFL, that's money. So it is an odd thing, and I don't know if Cal views the comments from Bill Belichick as an indictment or as something that he
Yeah.
kind of just already knew and accepted.
I think definitely his father would have because he was infatuated by the Patriots. Whether he will or not is a different matter. I also thought the Josh McCowan signing on a 2-year deal and then how he sort of talked glowingly about Easterby. That kind of made me feel a bit uneasy. Now, look, everybody talks highly of Josh McCowan about he's going to be a great coach if he wants to be, and maybe it's just a 2-year play deal, so they've got him next year to try and take him on the coaching staff if the next coaching staff want to do that. And I don't see why you wouldn't, even as a quality control guy or an assistant quarterbacks coach for a year or whatever it might be. But I thought that was odd, and it kind of just made me feel a bit uneasy again about Easterby and his influence in this building.
Yeah, the entire thing is just bizarre. But with Josh McCown, I I like the idea of having Josh McCown around, to be quite honest with you. But what it symbolizes, I think, is what is more concerning. And just to go back to your point, he didn't just speak glowingly of Jack Easterby. He spoke like Jack Easterby. Like my takeaway, and I was on that call too. My takeaway from the Josh McCown press conference is this is Jack Easterby with the football credentials. you know, like if Jack Easterby either played or coached football,
Yeah,
this would be Jack Easterby. That was, I mean, he sound like him. He used words. There are certain buzzwords for people that are kind of this ilk that you hear, and you're like, oh yeah, that's a certain type of person and personality. When they use words like serve and discernment, you know, these are words that because I mean I've been in these places. I know what the Southern Baptist sounds like, and
Yeah,
this is what it is, man. And so I'm like, hey, again, no judgment here, but it's saying something about what they want the tone to be. Go back to Amy Pausick. She didn't exactly sound like that. The way she moved and thought and what her energy was like seemed a little bit different to be in conflict. Let's just say, and so I'm just like, hey, man, this seems to be a theme here. And again, if it's its own singular thing, that's one thing, but to let it spill over into the football is concerning and makes you wonder a little bit of, hey, is everybody's head in the right space right now,
yeah, I think so. And before we finish up, Brandon, you got any picks for head coach or GM?
Yeah, so my pick for a head coach is not looking so good anymore. So I almost don't want to. I guess I could easily switch it since no one's heard it before. But I was on the Byron Leftwich bandwagon for a little while,
Yeah,
and I'm being talked off of it a little bit, or I'm off that ledge a little bit. So you know, I'm open. I like Eric Bieniemy. I don't know how much of that is liking Andy Reid,
yeah,
so like therefore I like Eric Bieniemy because I like Andy Reid, or hey, I like the way he talks. That's some of that Jack used to be Josh McCown stuff. I don't know how much I'm falling for
yeah,
something that doesn't really have to do with anything. If I'm distracted a little bit. Um, so I'm there. Um, I would personally love Lincoln Riley. I just don't think that it's a possibility. I don't think he would leave Oklahoma. From all accounts, he loves it there. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the direction is going to be. I know I'm intrigued by the people that think they should go with a defensive minded coach. Given that they already have a franchise quarterback who I think has been underdeveloped by who he's been coached by so far. I feel like you got to get somebody like obviously if you bring a defensive coach, you got to bring in a hell of an offensive coordinator to work with Deshaun Watson in this offense, which is still at this point the gem of the roster of the team. So I mean, there are a number of ways that they can go with this, and I think a lot of it has to do with the GM. I have far fewer GM candidates because to me, it's just harder to predict who is going to be a good GM in this league as it is maybe to say a coach. You can look at coaching trees and coaching tendencies and things like that and try to glean who might be good. Eric Bieniemy, Andy Reid, but at the same time, so is Matt Nagy, and I don't like how
yeah.
that's working out with the Chicago Bears. So, I mean, is Eric Bieniemy more like Andy Reid, or is he more like Matt Nagy? I would love to know the answer to that, but I wish I could know the answer to it before I made him the head coach of a franchise. But you can't. So I mean, I'm more just interested in observing and watching and seeing how it plays out, as opposed to like pretending like I've got the answers because I don't. But it's an interesting time, and it's a good time. I think it's a good time to start fresh and to get fresh ideas. But it's so critical that they nail it. That they get it right. You know.
Oh yeah, I mean they just can't. I keep having this sort of thought that they'll mess it up and they'll change after a year. That's why I keep thinking. I don't know why I've thought that for the last few weeks now. They'll bring somebody in and they'll just and the GM will sack them and they'll take somebody new in. I don't know. I just had that thought, but I hope it's not right. I think the defensive one's interesting. I think it's a good point you made because the offensive mind that would come in with a defensive head coach would have to almost supersede them in terms of football knowledge and experience. And Vic Fangio made a great career out of just going around and being the best, the best defensive coordinator. And Wade Phillips did it a bit as well, and racked at it sometimes. So if it's that kind of deal, you can do then fine. But yeah, I think it's so much hinges on it, and you just hope for everyone's sake that they get it right. But Brandon Scott, thank you very much for your time. I think it's a record length of podcast, but one hell of a conversation about a football team of two guys talking across the pond about a team that's in a bit of a sorry mess. But I think talking it over with you today definitely helps, and I hope it helps everybody listening just make a bit more sense of this funny old season in 2020.
Man, I enjoyed it so much I didn't even realize how long it was.
Yeah.
So I
All right.
appreciate you for having me, man.
Yeah, thanks, man. And I'll have you on again soon. But that's Brandon Scott from Radio 610, radio.com, and the host of the B Block podcast. We'll be back next week, hopefully, to talk about a Texans win against New England in the landscape of this season. It wouldn't seem likely, but hopefully have some positive news to talk about before the end of the season. And we're winding up for that head coach search as well. You could check us out on podcasttexans.com and at podcasttexans on Twitter. Thanks again.